In the night of the 24th of August, 1572, blood flowed through the streets of Paris. What began as a political assassination escalated into a massacre that claimed the lives of thousands across France. But the roots of this tragedy ran deep into the past, to a time when the French kingdom had fractured into two irreconcilable factions. France in the mid-15th century was enduring one of the most dramatic periods in its history. The Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517, had reached French shores and found numerous followers. The teachings of John Calvin appealed not only to commoners but also to members of noble families. French Protestants became known as Huguenots, and their numbers grew each year, along with the escalating conflict with Catholics. The religious schism evolved into a political conflict, as powerful aristocratic clans aligned themselves with each side. The Catholics were led by the Dukes of the House of Guise, who hailed from Lorraine and had managed to secure influential positions at the French court. They considered themselves protectors of the true faith, and were prepared to go to any lengths in their struggle against those they labeled heretics. The ancient House of Bourbon, rulers of the tiny kingdom of Navarre on the Spanish border, championed the Huguenots. The struggle between these two forces was not only for the souls of believers but also for power in France. The First War of Religion erupted in 1562. The spark was the massacre in the town of Vassy, where soldiers of Duke Francis of Guise attacked Protestants during a religious service, killing about 50 people. This crime marked a point of no return. Clashes erupted across the country. Catholics ransacked Protestant churches. In response, Huguenots seized monasteries, destroyed statues of saints, and desecrated relics. France plunged into an abyss of religious hatred, where each side believed it was their duty to destroy the enemy for the salvation of their own soul. 10 years before the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre, France had endured 3 bloody wars between Catholics and Huguenots. Each left behind thousands dead, cities in ruins, and villages razed. Peace treaties were concluded merely to allow both sides to regroup and prepare for a new wave of violence. Many leaders on both sides perished in these wars. Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre and father of a future French monarch, was killed. Duke Francis of Guise also fell, by a Protestant's hand, further fueling the thirst for vengeance among Catholics. But most dangerously, the religious conflict undermined the authority of the state. Twice, the Huguenots attempted to capture the young King Charles IX and his mother, Queen Catherine de Medici. The first attempt occurred in September 1567 near the town of Meaux, when Protestants hoped to bring the monarch under their control and impose their will. This action, known as the Surprise of Meaux, failed but left a deep scar on the royal family. The Valois felt like prisoners in their own country, surrounded by enemies ready to deprive them of their freedom or even their lives at any moment. By 1570, it was clear that France stood on the precipice. The endless wars had depleted the treasury, ruined the peasants, and crippled trade. The nobility of both parties suffered heavy losses, while the common people endured plunder and violence from both Catholic and Protestant detachments. The country needed peace, but achieving it proved impossible. Hatred between the confessions had reached such a fever pitch that any attempt at reconciliation was perceived as betrayal. In this atmosphere of mutual distrust and fear, a conspiracy was brewing that would soon shake all of Europe. Behind the young King Charles stood a woman whose name became a symbol of political cunning and ruthlessness. Catherine de Medici, born in Florence to a wealthy Italian family, found herself at the center of French politics through her marriage to King Henry II. When her husband died in 1559 from a wound sustained in a tournament, Catherine became Queen Mother and the de facto ruler of France during the minority of her sons. Her first son, Francis II, died of an ear infection in 1560, having reigned less than a year. Charles IX ascended to the throne, then only 10 years old. Catherine immediately took the reins of power, sidelining the Dukes of Guise who sought to dominate the court. She ruled in her son's name, controlled his every decision, and did everything possible to preserve the power of the Valois dynasty amidst the religious wars tearing the country apart. Catherine's policies were characterized by remarkable flexibility and pragmatism. Unlike the fanatical Catholics of the House of Guise or the uncompromising Huguenots, the Queen Mother was not guided by religious convictions. For her, the preservation of royal authority and the territorial integrity of France were paramount. She skillfully navigated between the warring factions, supporting one side or the other depending on the circumstances. At times, Catherine displayed a readiness for religious tolerance, issuing decrees that protected Protestant rights, But when Huguenots overstepped the bounds, she did not hesitate to unleash the full might of royal power upon them. The events at Meaux in 1567 were a severe blow to Catherine. The Huguenots' attempt to abduct her and the king demonstrated that Protestants no longer recognized legitimate authority and were willing to resort to any actions. From that moment on, the Queen Mother abandoned her policy of religious tolerance and sided with the Catholics. However, even after that, she did not consider religious war a blessing for France. Catherine understood that endless bloodshed was leading the country to ruin and sought a way to reconcile the warring factions without losing control of the situation. Charles IX, the nominal ruler of France, largely remained in his mother's shadow. By 1572, he was 22 years old but had never managed to break free from Catherine's tutelage. Contemporaries described the king as nervous, hot-tempered, and prone to sudden mood swings. He enjoyed hunting and physical exercise, but state affairs burdened him. The religious wars that had raged in the country since his childhood had fostered in him a deep distrust of both factions and a sense of his own powerlessness against the mighty aristocratic clans. However, in recent years, a man entered Charles's life who managed to win his trust and friendship. This man was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the most outstanding military commanders and politicians of his time. Coligny hailed from a noble family, received an excellent education, and had a successful career at court even before the religious wars began. In 1537, he was presented to King Francis I, quickly gained the monarch's favor, and received several important appointments. In 1552, Coligny was bestowed with the high title of Admiral of France. He distinguished himself as a talented general, achieving several important victories in the war against Emperor Charles V and King Henry VII of England. It was Coligny who, through negotiations, managed to preserve the city of Boulogne for France. His victory at Renty in 1554 brought him fame but also an enemy in Duke Francis of Guise, who believed that this victory belonged to him. From that moment on, a feud began between these two outstanding military leaders, which later escalated into mortal hatred. Coligny embraced Protestantism not for political reasons, but out of deep religious conviction. He became one of the main leaders of the Huguenots, and, in this capacity, commanded their troops during the religious wars. The admiral was distinguished by personal bravery, strategic thinking, and an unyielding will. He endured defeats but never lost hope for victory. For the Catholics, Coligny became the embodiment of the Protestant threat, a man whom they hated and feared more than anyone else. By 1570, it was evident that France could not continue the war. The Third War of Religion concluded in 1570 with the signing of the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The terms of this agreement were unexpectedly favorable to the Huguenots. They were granted freedom of conscience. They received the right to hold public office, and for their security, 4 fortresses were handed over to the Protestants, where they could station their garrisons. This was a compromise Catherine de Medici made, understanding that continuing the war would lead to the complete collapse of the state. But a peace treaty alone was not enough. A symbolic act was needed to show all of France and all of Europe that the era of religious wars had ended. Catherine decided to cement the peace with a dynastic marriage between Catholics and Protestants. The bride was to be her daughter, the 19-year-old Princess Margaret of Valois, known for her beauty, intelligence, and love of courtly entertainment. The groom chosen was the 18-year-old Henry de Bourbon, King of Navarre, and one of the Huguenot leaders. Henry of Navarre was the son of Antoine de Bourbon and Jeanne d'Albret, a fervent Protestant who had raised her son in the strict Calvinist tradition. After Antoine's death in the religious wars, Henry inherited the Navarrese throne and became one of the leaders of the Huguenot party. He was Margaret's second cousin and a prince of the blood, meaning he had claims to the French throne in the event of the direct line of the Valois failing. This marriage was intended not only to reconcile the warring factions but also to bind the dynastic interests of Catholics and Protestants. Negotiations for the wedding were long and difficult. The Catholic Church opposed a marriage between a Catholic and a heretic. Margaret herself felt no enthusiasm about the upcoming marriage. During the wedding ceremony, which took place on the 18th of August, 1572, in Notre Dame Cathedral, the bride remained stubbornly silent. When the priest asked if she agreed to marry Henry, Margaret uttered not a word. Then her brother Charles, standing beside her, nudged or pinched his sister, causing her to exclaim, which was interpreted as consent. Despite this unfortunate episode, the wedding took place with great splendor. All the Huguenot nobility, led by Admiral Coligny, flocked to Paris. the city filled with Protestants, who celebrated what seemed to be the beginning of a new era of peace and harmony. Catholics watched this gathering of heretics with undisguised displeasure and suspicion. Paris was and remained a stronghold of Catholicism. Its inhabitants hated the Huguenots and considered their presence in the city an insult to the true faith. In this atmosphere of hidden hostility and ostentatious merriment, gunpowder lay dormant, waiting for a spark. After the wedding, festivities began, which were to last for several days. Balls, tournaments, and theatrical performances were organized. Coligny, seizing the opportunity, grew close to King Charles and began to exert increasing influence over him. The admiral urged the young monarch to adopt an active foreign policy. He proposed supporting the Protestant uprising in the Spanish Netherlands against King Philip II by sending a united army of Catholics and Huguenots there. Such a war, according to Coligny, would not only weaken France's main enemy but also allow the energies of French Catholics and Protestants to be directed against an external foe, thereby strengthening the country's unity. Charles IX, who had lived under his mother's influence his entire life and had been unable to assert himself as an independent ruler, was captivated by the admiral's ideas. For the first time in his life, he found someone who treated him as a true king, not as a spineless puppet. Coligny possessed outstanding qualities as a military commander and statesman. His words were convincing, and his plans seemed bold and promising. The king began spending more and more time with the admiral, consulting him on the most important matters, and gradually came to regard him almost as a father. This growing closeness alarmed Catherine de Medici. The Queen Mother understood that she was losing control of her son, and with it, power over France. She categorically opposed a war with Spain, considering it madness that would lead to new calamities. Catherine saw how Coligny was gradually displacing her from the royal council and becoming Charles's chief advisor. For a woman accustomed to ruling the state alone, this was unbearable. The Dukes of Guise, the admiral's long-standing enemies, were also alarmed by his growing influence. They saw Coligny as a mortal threat to the Catholic cause and craved revenge for the death of their father, Duke Francis, who had been killed by a Protestant. In this situation, a plan to eliminate the admiral matured. Catherine de Medici and the Guises decided that the only way to break the dangerous bond between the king and Coligny was to kill the latter. The assassination was to appear as an act of revenge by the Guise family, unconnected to royal authority. For the execution of this plan, a professional assassin named Charles de Louvrier, Sieur de Maurevert, was hired. He was to shoot the admiral from an ambush and escape, leaving France ignorant of the true masterminds of the crime. On the morning of the 22nd of August, 1572, Admiral Coligny was returning to his apartments from a meeting of the Royal Council. He walked along Rue de Béthise accompanied by a small retinue. The admiral was in good spirits, discussing political matters with his companions. Suddenly, a shot rang out from a window of one of the houses belonging to the Guise family. One bullet hit Coligny in the arm, and another wounded him in the shoulder. The admiral fell but remained alive. The assassin fled through the back exit of the house, mounted a waiting horse, and disappeared from the city. News of the assassination spread instantly throughout Paris. Huguenots, who were still in the city after the wedding festivities, were enraged. They gathered at the house where the wounded admiral lay, loudly demanding justice and threatening vengeance. The Protestant leaders understood that the assassination could not have been the act of a lone individual. The Guises, and possibly the Queen Mother herself, were behind it. Some urged immediate departure from Paris and the resumption of war. Others insisted on demanding an investigation and punishment of the culprits from the king. Charles IX and Catherine de Medici immediately visited the wounded admiral. The king was shocked by what had happened. He had developed a genuine affection for Coligny and regarded the assassination as a personal insult. Charles swore that he would find and punish the culprits, that no one would be allowed to attempt to assassinate his loyal servant. He ordered his personal physician, the renowned surgeon, Ambroise Paré, considered the best medic in Europe, to attend the admiral. Paré examined the wounds and concluded that the admiral's life was not in danger. The bullets were extracted, and with proper care, Coligny was expected to recover. But the Huguenots were not appeased. Protestant nobles gathered around the wounded admiral's bedside, and their conversations became increasingly threatening. Some openly spoke of taking up arms and taking revenge on the Guises by their own hand, without waiting for royal justice. Others proposed capturing the king and the Queen Mother to force them to fulfill their promises. These words were conveyed to Catherine de Medici, and she was horrified. The Queen Mother realized that her plan to eliminate Coligny had not only failed but had also created a situation threatening the very existence of royal authority. Catherine immediately convened an emergency meeting with the king, Duke Henry of Guise, and several other close advisors. The discussion took place in an atmosphere of extreme tension. The Queen Mother persuaded her son that the Huguenots were preparing an uprising, that they would not stop at overthrowing the Valois dynasty and seizing power. She painted a picture for Charles of a bloody massacre that the Protestants would unleash if they were not preempted. The Guises supported her, pointing out that thousands of armed Huguenots were in Paris, ready to start a slaughter at any moment. Charles hesitated. On one hand, he did not want to believe in the betrayal of Coligny and his supporters. On the other hand, the words of his mother and the Guises instilled fear in him. The young king had lived his entire life in an atmosphere of conspiracies and betrayals. He remembered the Huguenots' attempts to abduct him, and now these memories returned with renewed force. Catherine continued to pressure her son, using all her eloquence and political experience. She convinced him that the only way to save royal authority and prevent civil war was to launch a preemptive strike and eliminate the Huguenot leaders before they could act. The arguments continued all day on August 23. Charles would agree with his mother, then retreat again, reluctant to issue an order for assassinations. Finally, late in the evening, exhausted by endless persuasion and fearful of a possible Huguenot uprising, the king capitulated. According to some sources, he uttered a phrase that went down in history: "Very well, kill them all, so that not one remains to reproach me." The decision was made. That very night, Coligny and other Protestant leaders in Paris were to be killed. Catherine and the Guises immediately began preparations. A list of individuals to be eliminated was drawn up. It included Admiral Coligny, Count de la Rochefoucauld, Count de Teligny, and other prominent Protestant leaders. Appropriate orders were issued to the city authorities and the commanders of the Royal Guard. It was decided to begin the operation at 3 a.m., when most Huguenots would be asleep. To distinguish Catholics from Protestants in the dark, the former were ordered to tie white armbands on their arms and affix white crosses to their hats. The signal for the massacre to begin was to be the tolling of the bell of the Church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, located near the Royal Palace of the Louvre. In the night of the 24th of August, 1572, Paris slept an uneasy sleep. In the houses where the Huguenots, who had arrived for the wedding, were staying, an atmosphere of tense anticipation prevailed. Many Protestants sensed danger and wanted to leave the city, but their leaders, including the wounded Coligny, urged them to remain and await the king's promised investigation. The admiral lay in his bed in his house on Rue de Béthesy, surrounded by bodyguards and friends. He was feeling better and hoped to be able to get up soon. Around 2 a.m., armed detachments began to move through the city. The Royal Guard took up positions at the houses where the intended victims resided. Duke Henry of Guise personally led a group heading to Admiral Coligny's residence. He was accompanied by his relatives and servants, armed with swords, daggers, and arquebuses. They surrounded the house, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Then, a portion of the men burst into the building and ascended the stairs to the admiral's bedroom. Coligny's servants and bodyguards attempted to resist but were quickly killed or dispersed. The assassins burst into the admiral's bedroom. Coligny, awakened by the noise, managed to get out of bed. He met his attackers calmly, with the dignity befitting a man of his standing. One of the assailants, a man named Bime, approached the admiral and struck him with his sword. Others joined in, and within moments, Coligny was dead. His body was thrown from the window into the courtyard, where Duke de Guise was waiting. He looked at the bloodied corpse of his old enemy and, convinced that the admiral was truly dead, gave the order to move on. Almost simultaneously with Coligny's murder, a massacre began throughout Paris. The signal bell of the Church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang around 3 a.m., though some sources claim the killings began even earlier. Following lists compiled by the royal authorities, detachments of guards burst into Huguenot homes and killed them, along with their families. Count de la Rochefoucauld was stabbed in his bed. Count de Teligny, Admiral Coligny's son-in-law, tried to escape but was caught and killed in the street. However, very soon, the targeted political assassination turned into an uncontrollable slaughter. The Parisian Catholics, hearing the church bells and seeing the royal guard killing Protestants, believed they had received a blessing to exterminate the heretics. A rumor spread through the city that the king himself had ordered all Huguenots to be killed indiscriminately. Crowds of armed citizens poured into the streets, breaking into houses where they knew or suspected Protestants lived. Plunder and mass killings began. Men, women, children, and the elderly were killed. No one was spared. Protestants were dragged from their homes, slaughtered in the streets, and drowned in the Seine. Their property was looted, and their houses were burned. The city turned into hell. The cries of the victims mingled with the shouts of the murderers. Blood flowed everywhere. Corpses lay in the cobblestones. Some Catholics tried to protect their Protestant neighbors, hiding them in their homes, but this was extremely dangerous. Anyone who dared to intercede for a heretic risked being killed themselves. Charles IX, in the Louvre, heard the screams and saw the glow of fires. He realized that the situation had gotten out of control. What was planned as a limited operation to eliminate a few dozen Huguenot leaders had turned into a mass slaughter. The king ordered an end to the killings, but his orders were not obeyed. The mob had gone mad, and no one could or would stop it. Paris plunged into an orgy of violence that lasted for several days. Henry of Navarre and Prince de Condé, the two most prominent Protestants present in Paris, were saved only by their royal status. They were arrested and imprisoned in the Louvre under guard. Charles IX told them that they must either convert to Catholicism or die. Henry, showing the political flexibility that would save his life many times later, agreed to convert to Catholicism. He understood that this was his only chance of survival. Margaret of Valois, Henry's wife, showed courage and steadfastness, sheltering her husband in her chambers and refusing to hand him over to the killers. She also saved several other Huguenots who sought refuge with her. By the morning of August 24, the streets of Paris were strewn with corpses. The exact number of victims on the first night is unknown, but historians estimate it to be several thousand. The massacre continued in the following days. Royal authorities attempted to stop the violence, but to no avail. The Parisian Catholic mob, having accumulated years of hatred for heretics, now had the opportunity to express it, and it had no intention of letting it pass. The killings continued until the end of August, gradually subsiding as the victims became fewer. Many Huguenots were already dead. Others had managed to flee the city or convert to Catholicism to save their lives. The events in Paris served as a signal for Catholics throughout France. News of the mass extermination of Huguenots in the capital spread quickly across the country, and everywhere local fanatics saw it as a call to action. In late August and September 1572, a wave of pogroms swept through French cities. The massacre engulfed Orléans, Rouen, Lyon, Bordeaux, Toulouse, and many other cities. Everywhere, the scenario was roughly the same. The Catholic mob, incited by local clergy and radical preachers, attacked Protestant communities, killing everyone they could find. In some cities, local authorities tried to stop the violence, but more often they either stood idly by or even encouraged the killings. Many Catholic priests asserted that the extermination of heretics was a God-pleasing deed, that by doing so they were cleansing France of its filth and saving the souls of the faithful Catholics. Protestants, caught off guard, offered little resistance. Many tried to flee, but the roads were controlled by Catholic detachments, and the fugitives were caught and killed. Some Huguenots took refuge in their fortified cities, where Catholics dared not attack them, but such havens were few. The massacre in Lyon proved to be one of the bloodiest. This wealthy trading city in southeastern France had a significant Protestant community. When news of the Parisian events arrived, the Catholic majority immediately took up arms. The killings began in late August and continued for several weeks. Protestants were dragged from their homes and killed in the streets. Their bodies were dumped into the Rhône River, which carried the corpses downstream. Local authorities not only did not hinder the massacre but actively participated in it. The Lyonnais slaughter claimed the lives of several thousand people. In Orléans, an ancient city on the banks of the Loire, Catholics acted more systematically. They compiled lists of Protestants living in the city and systematically exterminated them family by family. The killings were not carried out in a fit of spontaneous rage but methodically, almost routinely. This lent a particularly sinister character to the events. In Rouen, a major port city in the north, the massacre began in early September and lasted about a week. At least 1,000 Protestants died there. In Toulouse, in the south of the country, Catholics killed several hundred Huguenots, and their homes were plundered and burned. Events did not unfold according to a single scenario everywhere. In some cities, Local authorities managed to prevent massacres by sheltering Protestants or refusing to carry out orders from Paris. But such cases were few. In most places, the Catholic population enthusiastically set about exterminating their heretic neighbors. Religious hatred, accumulated over years, erupted, and the result was one of the most horrific massacres in European history. Royal authorities made attempts to stop the violence. Charles IX issued a decree prohibiting the killing of Protestants, but his orders were ignored. At the local level, royal officials either lacked the sufficient forces to confront the enraged mob or sympathized with the killers themselves. Catherine de Medici, realizing the scale of the catastrophe she had provoked, also tried to limit the bloodshed, but it was too late. The genie had escaped the bottle, and it proved impossible to put it back. The exact number of victims of the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre and the subsequent pogroms is unknown and will likely never be established. Early Protestant sources cited a figure of 100,000 killed, which is likely an exaggeration. Modern historians estimate the total number of deaths to be between 5,000 and 30,000 people, with a figure of around 20,000 to 30,000 considered most probable. Most victims fell in Paris and major cities, but killings also occurred in small towns and villages across the country. The massacre continued until mid-September, and in some remote areas, even longer. Gradually, the violence subsided. Catholics grew tired of killing. Many Protestants were already dead or had fled, while others were saved by converting to Catholicism. By the beginning of October 1572, the wave of killing subsided, leaving behind a devastated country and thousands of ruined lives. France plunged into stunned silence, trying to comprehend the scale of the tragedy that had occurred. The peace that the marriage of Margaret and Henry was supposed to bring turned into a bloody nightmare, the consequences of which the country felt for many years to come. News of the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre quickly spread throughout Europe, causing shock and outrage in Protestant countries. In England, Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, the event was perceived as a monstrous crime, proof that Catholics were prepared to commit any atrocity to destroy the true faith. Protestant preachers used the Parisian massacre as an example of Catholic barbarism, warning their congregations of the danger posed by the Roman Church. Pamphlets describing the horrors of the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre were printed in thousands of copies and distributed throughout Protestant Europe. Queen Elizabeth I of England, herself a Protestant, was deeply shaken by the news from France. She ordered her court to wear mourning and received the French ambassador in an atmosphere of icy silence, demonstrating her disapproval of Charles's actions. England broke off diplomatic negotiations with France, and relations between the two countries were on the verge of rupture. Demonstrations took place in London, with participants demanding that the Queen provide assistance to the French Protestants and punish those responsible for the massacre. In the German Protestant principalities, the Parisian events caused no less indignation. The German Lutheran princes saw in the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre confirmation of their worst fears regarding the Catholic threat. They strengthened their armies, preparing to repel a possible attack from Catholic states. In the Netherlands, where a war for independence from Catholic Spain was already underway, the massacre in France gave new strength to the rebels. The Protestant rebels used the Parisian events as an argument for continuing the struggle, asserting that surrender to the mercy of the Catholics would mean certain death. The reaction from Catholic states was entirely different. King Philip II of Spain, a fervent Catholic and an implacable enemy of Protestantism, reportedly laughed upon hearing of the massacre. It was said that for the first time in his life, he was seen laughing. He perceived the elimination of French Huguenots as a great victory for the true faith over heresy. Pope Gregory XIII ordered a Thanksgiving Mass to be held and a commemorative medal to be struck in honor of the extermination of heretics. The medal depicted a figure with a sword striking Protestants, with an inscription glorifying the event. Catholic Europe celebrated what Protestants mourned. This reaction from the Pope and Catholic monarchs further deepened the chasm between the two confessions. Protestants saw in the rejoicing of Rome and Madrid proof that the Catholic Church condoned mass murder, and that no reconciliation with it was possible. Catholics, in turn, viewed Protestant protests as hypocrisy, pointing out that Huguenots had also killed Catholics and destroyed churches and shrines during the religious wars. The Street Bartholomew's Day massacre became a symbol of the insurmountable schism in the Christian world, which shaped European politics for decades to come. In France, the royal authorities attempted to justify what had happened. Charles IX appeared before the Parliament of Paris on the 26th of August, 1572. He declared that he had ordered the killing of the Huguenot leaders to thwart a conspiracy they were preparing against him and his mother. The king asserted that he had acted in self-defense and for the protection of the state. He admitted responsibility for the killings, but presented them as a necessary measure directed against specific conspirators, not against all Protestants in France. This explanation convinced few. Protestants saw the king's words as an attempt to justify the unjustifiable. They pointed out that the victims were not only Huguenot leaders but also thousands of ordinary people, including women and children, who could not possibly have been part of a conspiracy. Furthermore, the very fact that the massacre continued for several weeks and encompassed all of France refuted the version of a preemptive strike against a limited group of conspirators. For Protestants, it was evident that the Bartholomew's Day massacre was the result of a deliberate policy of extermination sanctioned by royal authority. The reaction within France itself was complex and contradictory. Many Catholics, especially in Paris and other major cities, approved of the massacre, considering it just retribution for the heretics. They believed that France had thus been cleansed of its filth and that religious unity would now prevail in the country. However, there were those who condemned what had happened. Some Catholic intellectuals and moderate politicians understood that mass killings would not solve the religious problem, but would only deepen the schism and lead to new wars. The Bartholomew's Day massacre brought France neither peace nor the religious unity its organizers had hoped for. On the contrary, it opened a new, even more brutal phase of the religious wars. The surviving Huguenots, shocked by the scale of the massacre and the betrayal of royal authority, no longer believed any Valois promises. They took refuge in their fortresses in southern France and prepared for a long struggle. The Fourth War of Religion began as early as 1572 and continued until 1573. The nature of the conflict changed. Before the Bartholomew's Day massacre, Protestants believed they were fighting against the Catholic party, but not against the king. They believed the king was under the bad influence of the Guises and Catherine de Medici, and hoped to free him from this influence. After the massacre, these illusions were dispelled. The Huguenots realized that the king himself had sanctioned the killings, that royal authority had sided with their enemies. This realization had far-reaching consequences. For the first time in the history of the religious wars, Protestants began to question the legitimacy of Valois rule and to develop theories justifying armed resistance to a tyrant. Works by Protestant thinkers appeared, arguing for the right of subjects to revolt against a ruler who violated divine and natural laws. These ideas, revolutionary for their time, undermined the very foundations of monarchical power. The Protestants created something akin to an independent state in southern France, with its own organs of government, army, and finances. They no longer recognized the king's supremacy and were ready to fight for their freedom to the end. France was de facto divided into two hostile camps, and the prospects for reconciliation became increasingly dim. Charles, who had ordered the massacre, did not live long after these events. He died in 1574 at the age of 24 from tuberculosis. The last 2 years of his life, the king spent in torment, not only physical but also spiritual. There is testimony that he was haunted by nightmares in which he saw the bloodied bodies of the killed Huguenots. Charles allegedly confessed to intimates that he could not forget what had happened on Bartholomew's Day. Some contemporaries claimed that the king regretted his decision, but it was too late to change anything. After Charles's death, his brother Henry III ascended to the throne, reigning until 1589. The new king found himself in an even more difficult situation than his predecessor. The religious wars continued, and to the old conflict between Catholics and Protestants, a new one was added, between moderate Catholics, who supported the king, and radical Catholics of the Catholic League, led by the Guises. France plunged into chaos from which it could not extricate itself for almost 30 years. Catherine de Medici continued to play an important role in politics until her death in 1589. She never repented for organizing the Bartholomew's Day massacre, believing she had acted in the interests of the dynasty and the state. The Queen Mother tried to maneuver between various parties until her last days, seeking to preserve Valois rule, but her efforts were in vain. After her death, the Valois dynasty ended, and the former Huguenot Henry of Navarre ascended to the French throne, becoming King Henry IV. Henry IV, who miraculously survived the Bartholomew's Day massacre thanks to the protection of his wife Margaret, managed to put an end to the religious wars. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed Protestants freedom of conscience and equal rights with Catholics. This document became a turning point in French history. For the first time, religious tolerance was enshrined in law, and both confessions received the opportunity for peaceful coexistence. The Edict of Nantes remained in effect for almost a century, until it was revoked by Louis XIV in 1685. The memory of the street Bartholomew's Day Massacre was preserved in France and throughout Europe for centuries. For Protestants, this event became a symbol of Catholic fanaticism and cruelty, a reminder of the price paid for religious freedom. Artists, writers, and historians repeatedly returned to this theme, creating works intended to immortalize the memory of the victims and warn future generations against repeating such tragedies. The Street Bartholomew's Day Massacre went down in history as one of the darkest events of the era of religious wars, an example of the tragic consequences of intolerance and fanaticism. Historians still debate whether the Street Bartholomew's Day Massacre was the result of a pre-planned conspiracy or a spontaneous outburst of violence. Some researchers assert that Catherine de Medici and the Guises had long prepared for the mass extermination of Huguenots, or were waiting for the right moment. Others believe that the decision to kill was made spontaneously, in an atmosphere of panic after the failed assassination attempt on Coligny, and that initially, only a few Protestant leaders were intended to be eliminated, not to stage a general massacre. The French researcher Jean-Louis Bourgeon proposed a theory that the Street Bartholomew's Day Massacre was an ultra-Catholic conspiracy, led by Henry de Guise, and aimed against the moderate royal policy. According to this theory, radical Catholics took advantage of the assassination attempt on Coligny to provoke a mass slaughter that the royal authority could no longer stop. The pressure from the Spanish ambassador, who feared French intervention in the affairs of the Netherlands, the treasury's debts to the royal guards, and the dissatisfaction of the Parisian bourgeoisie with the heavy taxes may also have played a role. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The assassination attempt on Coligny was indeed organized by Catherine de Medici and the Guises, but initially, it was specifically about the murder of the admiral, not a mass slaughter. When the assassination attempt failed and the Huguenots began demanding justice, the royal family found itself in a critical situation. Catherine and her advisors feared that the Protestants would uncover the conspiracy and start a war, or even attempt to capture the king, as had happened before. In this atmosphere of fear and panic, the decision was made to launch a preemptive strike. The decision to kill the Huguenot leaders was made late in the evening of August 23 at an emergency meeting of a narrow council. Catherine convinced her son that the Huguenots were plotting a conspiracy and that immediate action was necessary. Thorough preparations were made. The municipality was ordered to lock the city gates, man the walls, arm the city militia, and secure the squares and intersections. The royal decree stated that in each house there should be an armed man with a torch and a white armband on his left arm, and in each house a candle should be lit. The provost of Paris, Claude Marcel, openly announced to the captains that the king permitted them to take up arms, that his intention was to destroy the admiral and his party, and that care should be taken that no one of these impious wretches escaped, and that the king commanded that other cities of the kingdom should follow the example of the capital. Thus, the massacre was not a spontaneous uprising but a planned operation, sanctioned by royal authority. However, the organizers lost control of the situation when the Parisian mob joined the killings, turning a political crime into a religious slaughter. On August 26, the king officially took responsibility for the massacre, stating that it had been done by his order. In letters sent to the provinces, to the Pope, and to foreign monarchs, the events were interpreted as a preemptive action against a conspiracy being prepared. This version was intended to justify the actions of the royal authority and to present the massacre as a necessary measure of self-defense. But few in Europe believed this explanation. Protestants saw in the Street Bartholomew's Day Massacre proof that Catholics were prepared to commit any crime to destroy the true faith. The Street Bartholomew's Day Massacre had a profound impact on political thought of the time. Protestant thinkers developed theories justifying resistance to tyrants and the right of subjects to revolt against rulers who violated divine and natural laws. These ideas were revolutionary for an era when monarchical power was considered sacred and inviolable. Catholics, in turn, also began to develop theories of tyrannicide, directed against Protestant rulers. Thus, the religious wars gave rise to new political concepts, that would later play an important role in the development of European political thought. The economic consequences of the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre were catastrophic for France. Many Protestants were members of the merchant class, artisans, and bankers. Their deaths or flight from the country dealt a severe blow to the French economy. Thousands of skilled specialists left France, taking their capital and knowledge with them. They settled in Protestant countries such as England, the Netherlands, German principalities, and Switzerland, where they were welcomed and made significant contributions to the development of local industry and trade. France, however, lost a significant portion of its economic potential, which weakened its position in Europe for many years to come. The cultural legacy of the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre was no less significant. This event inspired many artists, writers, and composers. The French painter François Dubois, himself a Protestant and a witness to the events, created a famous painting depicting the horrors of the massacre. This canvas became one of the most famous depictions of the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre and has survived to this day. The German composer Giacomo Meyerbeer wrote an opera dedicated to these events. Alexandre Dumas created the novel Queen Margot, in which the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre occupies a central place. The Street Bartholomew's Day massacre became a turning point not only in the history of France but also in the entire history of 16th century Europe. It demonstrated the tragic consequences that religious intolerance combined with political ambition can lead to. The events of that night showed that religious fanaticism can break down all moral barriers and turn civilized people into murderers. France paid a terrible price for attempting to resolve the religious conflict by force, and that price was measured in thousands of human lives and decades of further wars. After the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre, the nature of the religious wars in France changed. Protestants no longer believed the promises of royal authority and created an effectively independent state in southern France. They developed their own system of governance, created an army, and were ready to defend their freedom to the last drop of blood. Catholics, emboldened by the initial success of the massacre, formed the Catholic League, which sought not only to destroy Protestantism but also to subordinate royal power. France found itself divided into three hostile camps, and the end of this division was nowhere in sight. The Fourth War of Religion began almost immediately after the massacre and lasted until 1573. It was followed by the Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Wars, each bringing new destruction and casualties. France plunged into a state of chronic civil war, from which it could not emerge for almost a quarter of a century. Only the accession to power of Henry IV and the adoption of the Edict of Nantes in 1598 put an end to this nightmare. But the path to peace was long and arduous, and the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre was the darkest point on that path. Henry IV, the very Henry of Navarre, who miraculously survived the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre, became the king who managed to reconcile the warring parties. His famous phrase, "Paris is worth a mass," reflected his pragmatic approach to the religious question. Henry understood what his predecessors had not, that religious unity could not be achieved by force, and that the only path to peace lay through tolerance and compromise. The Edict of Nantes, which granted Protestants freedom of conscience and equal rights with Catholics, became a revolutionary document for its time. This edict remained in effect for almost a century and provided France with a period of relative peace and prosperity. However, in 1685, King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, making Protestantism illegal in France once again. This decision led to a new wave of emigration of Protestants, who left the country, taking their talents and capital with them. France once again paid a high price for religious intolerance, although this time without mass killings. The memory of the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre persisted in France for centuries. This event became a symbol of religious fanaticism and a reminder of the dangers of intolerance. French historians and thinkers repeatedly returned to analyzing those events, trying to understand how such a monstrous crime could have occurred and how it could have been prevented. These reflections influenced the development of ideas of religious tolerance and human rights, which later formed the basis of Enlightenment philosophy. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre continued to attract the attention of historians, writers, and artists. New studies were undertaken. Previously unknown documents were discovered, shedding light on the details of the conspiracy and the massacre. Each generation of historians interpreted these events in its own way, finding answers to the questions of its time. For some, The street, Bartholomew's Day Massacre was an example of political crime, for others, a religious slaughter, and for still others, a tragedy born of fear and hatred. Today, more than 450 years after those events, the street, Bartholomew's Day Massacre remains a subject of research and debate. Historians continue to dispute the degree of responsibility of various participants, the motives of the conspirators, and whether the tragedy could have been prevented. But regardless of differences in interpretation, all agree on one thing: the street, Bartholomew's Day Massacre was one of the darkest pages in European history, a reminder of what religious and political intolerance can lead to. The lessons of the street Bartholomew's Day Massacre are still relevant today. In a world where religious and ethnic conflicts continue to claim thousands of lives, where fanaticism and intolerance still find their adherents, the memory of the events of 1572 serves as a warning. History shows that the path of violence never leads to lasting peace, and that attempts to resolve ideological disputes by force result in tragedy for all parties. Only dialogue, compromise, and respect for the rights of every individual can ensure the peaceful coexistence of people with different beliefs. The street, Bartholomew's Day Massacre ended, but its echo resonates through the centuries. The names of the dead are forgotten, their fates dissolved in the flow of time. But their deaths were not in vain if they taught humanity to value peace and tolerance above religious and political ambitions. France has traversed a long and arduous path from the massacre of 1572 to the recognition of freedom of conscience and the equality of all citizens, regardless of their religious beliefs. This path was paved with victims, but ultimately led to the creation of a society where people of different faiths can live in peace and harmony.